Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our environmental justice panel. I'm so excited to have all you attendees here, and I'm honored to have our panelists here speaking tonight. This seminar series is hosted by CU Boulder's Society of Environmental Engineering students, as well as in partnership with the CU Environmental Engineering Program, the Bold Center, and CU Boulder's chapters of the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers and the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers. I would like to thank the whole group of environmental engineering students that helped organize the seminar series this fall, and a special thanks to Dr. Rosario and Dr. Milford for all of their help in organizing and supporting this group of students. You all have made me very proud to be part of an undergraduate community that is taking steps to educate ourselves and develop skills to understand and to change the political and social contexts in which our engineering field is set. We hope that this series has served to galvanize discussion on the intersection of social justice, sustainability, and engineering, and I know that this panel will be a great culmination of that. I hope that it's also a point for us as a community to consider critically our role as students, as professionals. So I'm really happy to have you all here, and thank you so much for taking time this evening to do some more Zoom. I'm happy to introduce my peers, Jenna and Belle, who are also undergraduate students.
Thanks, Abby. It is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. Michelle Gabrieloff-Parish is currently the Climate Innovation Program Manager for Movement Strategy Center, the founder of Candela's Glows, and the former Assistant Director for Energy and Climate Justice at CU Boulder's Environmental Center. We also have Michaela Ironchill Dominguez, the Vice Chair and Board Member for the International Indigenous Youth Council and founder of Women of the Mountain. And finally, we have Fatuma Ahmad, the co-founder, executive director, and head farmer of Frontline Farming, member of the Sustainable Food Council for the City of Denver, and lecturer in the Masters for Environmental Studies program at CU Boulder. Thank you all for being here today and for sharing your knowledge and experience with our program.
Thank you, Jenna. I am honored to present our moderator for the panel, Dr. Laura MacDonald. Laura is the Managing Director of the Mortenson Center in Global Engineering and the Global Engineering Undergraduate Program here at CU Boulder. Her background is in human geography and environmental engineering with a focus on water and sanitation in low and middle income countries. Thank you so much for being here today, Laura. I would also like to take a moment to remind our audience to put questions into the Q&A chat, and we will be addressing them throughout the panel.
Great, thanks so much, Belle. I'm thankful to Seven and its collaborators for bringing this panel together and for the opportunity to learn from you, Michelle and Fatuma, and hopefully Michaela will be able to join us. I would like to also add that Michelle and Fatuma really are here to speak to you as students in the audience and to learn from you and your interests. And so they expressed interest in knowing specifically what you're interested in with regards to how to incorporate environmental justice into the projects that you're doing, any specific areas that you're thinking about, so that we can kind of weave that throughout the conversation. So to give y'all time to express yourselves in the chat and warm up on some questions and answers, we'll have the panelists first introduce themselves. So I'd like to give each of you 5 minutes to introduce yourself and your work, and given the focus of today's panel, to speak a bit to how you've resisted environmental injustice through education, be that through your own education or through educating others. So Michelle, could you start for us?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's good to be back at CU. I left just in June to go to Movement Strategy Center working on policy work. And really before I begin, want to acknowledge, as I'm still in Colorado, I'm in Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute territories. And I might actually share my screen with you all. I'm guessing most people are in Colorado. But in case you're not, there is a wonderful map that helps you learn more about the Native people on the land that you're on. It's www.native-land.ca. And I think that especially for folks looking at environmental engineering, this is such a good practice to to do, one, as a form of allyship, and because Native people put together this map, they're asking us to do this. And also because how can you really know what's appropriate for a site or for a project if you don't know what has come before? So there's actually, in this allyship, there's also a lot of gifts that come back to us in knowing where we are and who the peoples are of that land. How did they grow food? How did they build shelter? How did they manage water? How did they build with solar? So I want to just start out with that. So please go and check it out. I also encourage people to, even once you know the territories that you're on, also think about where you were born and just, get to know your environment better and your history better. As for my work, I have really worked at trying to bridge environmental and social justice issues for most of my life at this point. Even as a kid growing up in the Cold War, trying to bring attention in elementary school to the ramifications of nuclear weapons, to being in college and being involved in groups that were very separate at the time, the environmental groups and the social justice groups. And there was really no overlap at that time, and trying to bridge that overlap. And as people say now, getting a lot of side eye for it. So that's been a lot of my work. That was definitely my work at CU Boulder as the Assistant Director for Energy and Climate Justice, and just really trying to help bring awareness to people who care about environmental issues, why social justice matters, and how you will not get to our climate goals, to our environmental goals, without having equity as a part of that. And talking to our social justice communities and frontline communities and environmental justice communities about the ways that ecology works and how to do ecological repair and ecological design. So now at Movement Strategy Center, a lot of our work is really around helping communities and policymakers work together and have policymakers let go of power and resources towards the community, and let the community start being empowered and in a place where they can confidently take those resources and know the ways that they want to move forward with it. So that's the brief introduction.
Thank you, Michelle. Fatuma?
Awesome. I'm actually gonna kick us off with a little slideshow by way of introduction. I think it always works better to see some good natural pictures while we talk. So I'm always happy to be here with my dear sister and colleague, Michelle, and present with her. And thank you all for valuing our voice and inviting me here to present today. So as was said, I'm the executive director and co-founder with my colleague, Dr. Damian Thompson, of Frontline Farming, and also the head farmer there. We are a BIPOC and WomenX-led organization working towards food sovereignty and farmer liberation. Specifically, we work on farmer advocacy and food justice across the Front Range. We cultivate a total of about 5 acres on 3 plants and spread across Jefferson, Denver, and Adams County, where our farms are located. We actually approach our work with a sense of ethics that we've cultivated, and in a framework of security, justice, and sovereignty. So when we think about security, we're really thinking about solving immediate needs for people, giving them food now. We know that issues around food really revolve around poverty. We live in a society where we've reached about 42% food waste. And so we know it's not about production of food itself. We do things like this, and as we go, you guys can kind of see there's that equality framework that can fit within the security paradigm. And we do this through our free grocery program, of course, by growing food, thousands of pounds in a year, our Healing Foods program, where we directly supply food to those we find are the most vulnerable in our food system at a given time. So we specifically focus on women and children. We did service terminally ill in the past and have really shifted to immigrant communities right now because they're facing a lot of issues with the past administration in terms of rhetoric as well as policies in relation to public services. We believe in working on justice, and for us, we recognize that justice is appealing to a system as it is. It's not necessarily taking us out of that system, and we know that for many Black and Brown people, the same systems of law that we look at to uphold frameworks of justice have been complicit, if not downright the actualizers of very unjust policies such as USDA, towards Black land, and all sorts of legal institutions we could think about that have disenfranchised and taken Native lands away. So one way we see it is through this Audre Lorde quote, "For the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And as one of our mentors and colleagues, Devon Pena, likes to say, we don't want a piece of the same pie at the same carcinogenic level, So we do policy work through, for example, our Project Protect Food Systems we launched this year that's really looking at protecting our food systems workers that have been completely neglected in relief packages. I serve as the president for Mile High Farmers here, and all of our farmers do different things such as representing on different coalitions. All our farmers receive a living wage, health benefits, year-round employment. They sit on our board themselves and usually represent us and give talks like this rather than just me. And lastly, we believe in sovereignty. I just want to say these aren't all, it's not a teleological end of just we're aiming for sovereignty. We recognize that as humans in both our personal and work life, that we're probably approaching these different dimensions in different ways. And so it's important to think about that and to really think about how we push past the status quo to things around liberation that take us out of these systems that have certainly not served a lot of our communities. We do that through education. Education is powerful. That's why I'm here even today. That we offer to our communities. We have the Black and Brown Growers Collective. We started across Colorado. We have different foodways on our farms, like our African foodways, to tell a different story about food and people that were brought here from Africa, weaving seeds in their hair, and that are really, skilled agricultural workers, just like many of our immigrant people, 70% who make up our farming system. And of course, the practices that we use for growing our food. So that's a little bit about us and what we do. And really, I'm interested here in talking to you all, particularly about energy justice, and specifically to different systems of commonly used forms of energy and how we think about renewable energy in our times and how that affects BIPOC communities, and then just a framework of thinking about distribution and who, receives the benefits of many of these things and where the burdens are placed, and then thinking about procedural justice and who's represented in these decision makings and how they're made. So, and of course, if we want, we can think of specific Colorado examples that are really important right now, like what's going on with Suncor, and things like that. So that's a little bit about me, and open to questions and conversation. I'll turn it back to you guys.
Thank you, Fatuma. So we definitely have an incredible opportunity to learn from both of you with regards to food justice and energy justice. Before diving into specifics of those topics, I was hoping that each of you could shed some light on what your perception is of environmental justice, how you came to that understanding, and how you came to focus on environmental injustice and the pursuit of justice in your careers. Fatuma, I'm going to switch it up and have you go again.
Well, I guess I'll take it to sort of our present times and really even a conversation we were having earlier today. But as we hear about Black bodies being attacked by extensions of our state and police brutality against them, and slogans like "We can't breathe," these are phrases that cut across our communities, not only articulated in straight violent ways like that, but in relation to the rates of asthma our communities have, the fact that our communities are twice as likely to die at a hospital from asthma on top of it, the fact that our Black communities, over 70% are located within 30 miles of coal plants. And so I think for us as BIPOC communities, the issue of our environment and finding space in it, and not only finding liberation for ourselves in terms of safe housing and safe drinking water and all these different things are topics that have always been linked with energy and environmental justice. Sometimes the language of energy justice, particularly when you think about air quality measurements, I find it also intimidating when I think about water justice, and it always seems so scientific and outside of our scope of activism in so many ways that it's made technological. And yet the suffering is on our bodies, and there's so many ways that people know and understand it. And of course, we hear a lot about creating data that links these things. And so I think as students and academic, we have a role of how we make these linkages and support communities in those ways. But I think for me, it's something that's always been a part of my struggle for justice, and perhaps I've been able to find words for it as I've, become more immersed as a professor in environmental studies within the language of energy justice and whatnot. And a lot of that is newly emerging language as well.
Thanks. Michelle?
Well, for me, actually doing work at CU made me think about where did this come from, and it made me realize that I actually grew up with this ethos, and that my parents, we left Colombia when I was a small child in South America, and Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and in creating and then fighting the drug problem that, with the US's drug war, they were spraying the country, they were spraying the jungle with defoliant and trying to kill the jungle in order to try to unmask where coca was being grown. And so it actually took me being an adult and having people ask me questions like that to realize, like, oh, actually, I grew up with this ethic, and it being like, this is, politics at the dinner table almost every night about the drug war and the violence and the difficulties that Colombia was facing, and having such a big part of that be the wasted ecological treasure that is there, and the fact that there was heartache over somebody getting kidnapped, and then the next night there was heartache over how can you defoliate where the earth has the most biodiversity in birds, for example. And something that I think I really learned from my parents and family is that you don't have to have an engineering degree, you don't have to have a permaculture certificate, you don't have to be like an expert in ecology to know what so many people around the world know, which is how to really steward the land. And even not having the distinction between like people and nature, which I think is really strong in the culture here, that actually causes a lot of problems. And I'm reminded, there's this wonderful book by Kat Anderson, Tending the Wild, that all of you should go and check out. And she talks about how for a lot of the California native peoples, the word wilderness is like a bad word. It means a place that is unkempt, that people have like disregarded, that nobody cares about. And And so I think that there's a lot of gifts in there for us to think about how, you know, our mainstream culture sort of sees humans like a virus and a bad thing for nature. And yet, you know, if you look to our ancestry in Colombia and in the Amazon, it actually turns out that the Amazon is a cultural artifact and that Native people built the conditions for the Amazon to be possible. So I think that's some of where that comes from that I wasn't always conscious of. And in terms of what environmental justice means to me, I think Majora Carter just said it beautifully. She just basically said, environmental justice means that no community should have to bear the burdens without the benefits, and no community should have all the benefits without bearing any of the burdens. And right now, she says, you know, class and race are the best indicators of where you're going to find toxic sites, of where you're going to find pollution, where you're going to find landfills. So yeah, to me, environmental justice is really the move to change that. And as Fatuma said, not just make it so like all the burden is shared equally, but really get to the heart of the problem and say, what if we lived in line with our ecology so that some of those burdens and some of those sacrifice zones didn't even have to exist?
Thank you, Michelle. And for those of us who are new to environmental justice, who perhaps live more on the benefit than the burden side, how would you both recommend? I mean, I know learning is only the initial step, but we're here talking about education to fight environmental injustice. So outside of those who are pursuing a specific career in environmental justice and are more embedded in it, what would you recommend as kind of initial steps to better learn and engage in the topic and how to take part?
I'll say for me, one of the main things is really learning about colonialism. Take a moment, start to learn about it. I actually tell people, if you haven't cried about what you've learned about colonialism, then you haven't looked at it deeply enough. And that comes easier for some of us than for others, but generally that's the case. And something that I've done just for myself, and I actually have presented about it a couple of times too, is, you know, I go to Google Maps, I look at the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and I just zoom in and you can see the border. Dominican Republic is green and Haiti is deforested because Haiti had to pay reparations to France for their liberation. And so to me, that's such a good, easy way to see, like, you can actually see the ecological traces of colonialism there. There's a lot of places like that. I actually, because of the nuclear work that I do here, everybody at CU is like 8 miles away from Rocky Flats, which is one of the centers of nuclear weapon production during the Cold War. 70,000 nuclear pits were made there. And so I've actually also Googled the Nevada test site, and you can just Google and zoom in and just see the craters. So, you know, some of it is accessing, you know, maybe we'll chat in the principles of environmental justice. Those are great. Food sovereignty principles, we can chat in some of those resources, and then also just, you know, trying to explore your world and, you know, look up some of your questions even on Google Maps. Like, can you trace some of these things? And then we also maybe at the end can also put some book resources and stuff in the chat. But really a lot of this is about a different way to see the world and really asking yourselves the question of, like, of almost any project you're working on, and I've got a slide on this, who benefits and who pays? And then not just who benefits and who pays, but in what ways? Because sometimes we're benefiting with convenience and then people are paying with breath. So yeah, Fatuma, what about you?
Yeah, I feel like that's a great answer, Nicole. Certainly, you know, in any value of equity, we always ask people to educate themselves. And then certainly taking opportunities like this to be brave and have conversations and ask the questions you want to ask. There are plenty of difficult places to have this conversation, and this is the right place to have it. And yeah, I guess like in a basic historical overview, just the understanding, I think, that of the environmental movement being separate from the environmental justice movement, and really understanding that the environmental justice movement itself was articulated, as I really chopped here, as these principles as the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And I think that it's important to recognize that this movement was started as called environmental racism, and really brought together a couple different streams at that time that were occurring, particularly from the civil rights movement. So the civil rights was really instrumental, and really they call the Warren County protests in North Carolina as one of the first movements towards it. But we also know that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have been here fighting this type of settler colonialism and, exploitation of the land in many ways for far before that. And then also the merging of certain sort of occupational based groups and movements like Cesar Chavez, and merging that with these conversations around pesticides and abuses there. We know right now, again, when we say we can't breathe, that 300,000 primarily Latinx workers are poisoned from pesticides yearly. We know that, when all the smoke was falling from the skies, I mean, I was dying working outside, but you probably saw the images of these farm workers, of everyone leaving all the grapes in California with all the immigrant and Latinx communities there with the fires enveloping them. So I think understanding the history, it diverges a lot from the environmental movement, which we see the environmental movement really focused on nature itself. And in general, there's a long history of even the beginning of those environmental movements that did a lot of disservice, as has been acknowledged by the Sierra Club this year, the Audubon Society, not only have racist roots, but actually have roots that include a lot of eugenicist movements in that time, just as a fact. So if you want to look up people like Madison, Roosevelt, people like that. Madison is one of the first kind of creators of our national park system, and a lot of people involved in that. So it's important to understand history. And at the same time, the simultaneous creation of reservations as we created national parks. And so this idea in the environmental movement that removes people from it, but posits another kind of people for recreation, sometimes even recreation of the people themselves, like Indigenous people who still lived in national parks and really were removed later and over time, although they were sites to visit themselves. And even then, just to, speak to the fact that, we haven't lived a long time since Black people in America have had the same socioeconomic access. And when we think about natural spaces and access to that, I mean, Black people couldn't even really travel, and thus created things like the Green Book to tell you where places were safe. And so land has also been kind of really set aside in a lot of ways from us. And then when we seek, common issues like people having fear of running outside or recreating in certain ways that are of color and being shot when they do so, are just kind of upshots of this kind of system. So yeah, I guess there are many ways one can start. I do food work, and I don't do food as just food, right? Food determines GDPs. Food is about culture. Food is intersectional into so many parts of our lives. And we as humans, regardless of what work you do, are intersectional yourself, and intersectionalities of all the different things exist within you as well, just as much as they exist in our society. And so I like to try to find an avenue of approach. I'm a food grower. I've been doing that for a long time, and I like to do different things, but I also like to focus and make a change where I can.
Thanks, Fatuma. So you've both really touched on the importance of knowing our history, knowing about the colonial roots of persistent environmental injustices and environmental racism. So I wanted to pull in a question from Katie Matos, who's working on water and sanitation infrastructure in rural Alaska Native communities. And she asked you both to speak a bit to the challenges of working to help a community get their basic needs met while not upholding colonial systems and power dynamics that are in place.
Yeah, that is a huge question for so many people around the world. I mean, even including here, I think Detroit is asking themselves the same question. How do you start to access and support your local, regional, or native sources of wisdom? And how do you, you know, I would even say like get out of the way of letting people do that. Because what I have found is that so many times communities have a lot of these solutions already, but they don't have the resources and they don't even have the same lexicon to translate it into environmental engineering or into political speak that really actually makes a difference in our political system. And we know that. I put in there for Katie, Dr. Conejo Werner's information, who works on rural water systems and environmental justice, is a doctor of environmental engineering who teaches at Chico State, who we co-founded a really cool project at CU called Flows, which is still happening now without either one of us. Yeah, so I think a lot of it is about finding that. And what I love is that a lot of times the same ways that you solve ecological problems are the same ways that you solve cultural problems. So in any ecology, if you're doing restoration work, regeneration work, you really go and look for what is working. In any ecological system, something is working. You know, I've been to places where people are like, this field is compacted, the soil is dead, nothing will ever grow. But there's stuff growing there, right? So find what is working well within that system, and then you support it. You let it grow. You let it do its job. So that's some of what I can think of, and I think there's some real beauty to sort of pausing and also seeing like how does nature do what it is that you're trying to do, and trying to work in tandem with nature to get it done. Fatuma, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really an important question, actually a topic we've been talking a lot about this week with my own students. And I think it's important to understand that right now in time, it's important that we don't use concepts like decolonization as a metaphor, and that we understand that it's a real action that asks us to push past the systems that, you know, either uphold our privileges or make us want to assimilate into them in order to be accepted. Or even as a discursive practice, I see it a lot of like, oh, well, we're just gonna be decolonizing that in this panel here. And it's like, I don't know that we're doing that, you know what I mean? And so I think it's being real about where you're at in the process. How I could speak to how I try to approach it myself in my own work. So, you know, one way is thinking about creating alternative structures and language around things. So we try not to use like words like contract and agenda and all these things that have to do with colonial timeframes and time sets that really start to influence your mind and make you think that there's only one way of understanding knowledge or showing up. I very much do it myself as engaging with concepts of epistemology. I think that's really important for you all as researchers, and particularly even within energy studies and renewable energy, to really ask about questions about who is knowledgeable. Why do I give them that credit of being knowledgeable? A lot of times we see environmental justice and environmental movement itself can come into conflict, right? And so, you know, even for us that come from, you know, different places, we find that there's so many ways in which knowledge that our own ancestors and families hold is very demeaned, and seem to be like, oh, well, you need to get your GED or go to community college and all these things. But these elders and so many of our mothers have knowledge that's irreplaceable that we don't take the time to value. So I think very much as researchers, that's important. I think that giving credit when you engage with communities to them for their knowledge that they're giving you, rather than just instrumentalizing them for your own work. In organizational structure, we think a lot about relationship building. We're often told that where we go to work or school is not where we make friends, or to not do that. So we interrogate that concept a lot and think about what it means to be in community with each other. We do things like, making sure our board represents the kind of power and leadership that we think should be reflected. We do it by ensuring that our farmers vote on our board and that there's no division between our board and our farmers, where our board ends up telling us, well, we don't really like that idea. And me in between being like, oh, well, let me see if the board will go for that, right? So I don't vote on the board, but everyone else does. So there's a lot of ways we can think about, how we push ourselves out of these contexts, or at least not, re-instrumentalizing, re-actualizing them. And those are many steps. And so even for me, I'm trying to create that in alternative ways by creating alternative spaces, even having farms that, most farmers in the United States are people of color. 70% are immigrant, and 3/4 of that are undocumented. Yet our image is of this white male farmer. Across the world, mainly women are farmers. And so even placemaking, right? Having land and creating that openness for people to come on that land and reconnect. So those are examples. I don't have some one, way, but fighting, and first of all, you have to understand that, these actions are violent and that it takes some form of like standing up to that and knowing that there are consequences to it, and can be when you're kind of pushing against a system that's the status quo. And that second, it's not about positing some future for yourself so much as knowing that it's messy. It's going to be messy.
So Fatima, building off of that kind of creation of your own system and giving space, another question from a student was whether you have any advice to create space for BIPOC in majority white spaces, thinking majority white environmental activists or white volunteering spaces.
Sure. I'm going to give Michelle an opportunity. You wanted to say something, Michelle?
Oh, sorry. Michelle.
No, it's okay. I think she was going to follow up. And then if you want to take that question off, you can, Michelle, or I'll take it. Go ahead.
I thought you were just dancing, Michelle.
I was trying to get in there, but
oh, sorry.
Well, Fatuma was giving really good concrete examples of how to do some of this work, and it just also made me think of some ways that I've seen it done in academia when I think it's been good, where for example, not just giving people credit, but even paying them for their knowledge, right? Just like you would another expert. And that's been part of the model that I've been using with all of my work, which has kind of been a game changer. And then recently I worked with Phaedra Pazzulo and Constance Gordon, who came along actually on a tour that I hosted, where we went to Fatima's farm and a couple of other farms. And they did an academic article about how we're redefining embodied cartographies, I think it was. And they made me a co-author, and they gave full credit to all of our participants. So, there's also things that you can do like that, like actually giving academic credit and not just being like, so another place you can find some of these injustices is looking at articles, books, journals, where it'll be like, I met with a Native elder and that changed my blah, 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 and it's like, well, does that person have a name? Do they have recognition? Like, only don't make it so that only you are benefiting from publishing this article, but also get the other person their credit. And, I find it again and again and again in all kinds of books, academic and not, where it's like, I met with a Native group, and it's just like no details. And you would never be like, I met with the faculty committee, and not name which committee and who was on there. So, trying to think through like how you show respect, and also asking folks how they want respect shown, because sometimes the things that we think show respect actually don't to other people. So making sure that you know how they want to be treated.
Yeah, I recently encountered specific journals that are providing the opportunity outside of the traditional recognition of authors further structuring of acknowledgements where you're supposed to kind of list everyone who was involved in the different roles, and for the authors themselves, kind of breaking down that first author, last author, and asking you to speak to what each author contributed as well, to kind of break down that power dynamic of that kind of system that's just assumed is how everything works, and build in greater recognition for those who are doing the work, and also perhaps those who are doing different amounts of work.
Yeah. And now I forgot your question.
So returning to the other question, and I'll try to keep a better eye on your dancing, Michelle, so when you want to hop in. The question was, do you have any advice to create space for BIPOC in majority white spaces that you might find in an environmental activist group or a white volunteering space?
Yeah, in my experience, you just do it. You literally do it. You're like, this is going to be this space, and you create the space. Of course, that only works if you're a person of color, and then if you're not, then you have some more work to do, I guess, in
Right.
making sure that you have some of those relationships and allyship and finding ways to support that. But yeah, I feel like, especially at a place like CU, like you literally start putting out posters, or also, you know, what I was talking about before, the best practice culturally and ecologically is look for what's already being done. There are already those circles in existence. So you want to find them, see if they're right for you, grow them, or deepen them, or, you know, just go and do it if it's not there. And, you know, part of what the feminist movement showed us was that personal is political. If you're struggling with a set of questions, other women are struggling with the similar questions. And I think it's the same thing with trying to create, space for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color at a place like CU. Is what things you're struggling with, for sure other people are struggling with, and starting with those questions. You don't have to be an expert just to hold space.
Fatuma, would you like to add anything?
It's such a tricky or interesting question, because I don't have context specific for it, so I could take it in a lot of different ways of understanding it. You know, the way that, like, if we're like, how do we create space for BIPOC in white community, in sense of like, how do we bring them in? Or how is it that when they're in community that we create that space? So I could speak to, let's say, like for me, in my experience, when I started farming my land, or land here, I you know, the first thing I did was I went to the Indigenous communities I knew here and asked them how I could serve them. I didn't ask them to show up for me. You know, I asked them, I was like, I'm ready, I'm about to start this project. So what do I need to do to offer skills I have to be in community with you, you know? So I think it's important to, you know, show up for people before you ask them to show up for you. Of course, we recognize, like, even in presenting or speaking about race and racism and sexism, and Michelle talks a lot about polycultures, is that we're not here to speak about identity politics per se, although identities have influenced and created structures of oppression here and across the world. But we're here to talk about how we benefit and why it's beneficial to have diversity in environment as well as within our own communities. It's just kind of a scientific fact. And so when we look at nature, just as we do in our own communities, that's important. I don't think that's a question that me and Michelle can necessarily answer in that way, you know, but is a question for white communities to do for themselves. For BIPOC folk, you know, I asked an elder woman once, you know, why is it I'm always invited to panels as a farmer that's about, you know, being a woman of color, or, you know, farmers of color panels, or even as a professor. And I was like, man, what's up with that? I wasn't invited as like the expert for these other panels, but I'm invited for this. And like, you know, even though it's like this big thing, you know, and could be an honor, I just don't feel that way. And so the advice I was given is like, you know, as a BIPOC person, you go to where you want to go, where you're invited, and you say what you want to say, you know. And if people are going to invite me to speak within that paradigm, I can go and I can speak about the things that I feel are important for me to get across and represent for my own community. So that's the best way I could answer that at this moment. But there's certainly a lot of tools you can engage in around it.
I'm glad you addressed that. I just assumed it was people of color saying, how do we create space? So I was like, do it.
So Fatima, you touched a bit on in speaking to the creation of national parks at the same time that reservations were created. Michelle, you touched a bit on the opportunity to pay people for their knowledge and their participation. And so a question that has come up that kind of brings two of those together in a way is about like whether there's a role for reparations in achieving environmental justice and equity, and a more specific subset, should NGOs like the Nature Conservancy return conservation lands to Native peoples?
I'll kick us off, and I'm going to share my screen here. So
Okay.
Let's have a conversation about reparations. Reparation. It's an important conversation and actually has become relevant for the first time in political discourse in a way in terms of the Hill and whatnot, and I'll get to that, than ever has been, and even let alone under Barack Obama. Reparations, you know, when we talk about it, oftentimes we're thinking about Black people, and based on labor stolen specifically from Black people, not so much even land. And we're thinking about that from this period of, you know, the time that people were brought here to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 to 1885. So those 250 years of slavery is about 60% of US history. And if we count 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, then about 80%. There are organizations that work on this, like the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations. I could pull that up for you here. But what's important to know is that they like have specific way of addressing it, and that the demands of reparations are specifically made to government and corporations. So not just individuals, although the hope would be that like, you know, individuals themselves would contribute where that's seen. And then it's important to recognize that places like Georgetown University students endorsed a referendum that was based on the 272 slaves that were sold to settle a debt the school had, and it still hasn't passed. We hear a lot of arguments against this, like slavery happened so long ago. Now all white Americans have slave owning ancestors. While we acknowledge that, you know, wealth and wealth accumulation is obviously like a clear disadvantage, you know, when we think about slavery happening so long ago, it's important to recognize that most white people can trace their lineage of being here from at least 3 generations, but often 4 to 20 with pride. And when we think about Black folks, it's only been maybe 2 generations since socioeconomic status access has even been allowed. So it's important to think about history in that way. And when people argue about, you know, not having slave owning ancestors, it was merchants and sheriffs and everyday people that upheld a system of slavery and benefited from it. So it's important to think about that. When we think about like sort of what's going on in terms of actual wealth right now, it's pretty sad, right? A college educated Black person makes less than a white person, or has less wealth than a white person who has less than a high school education. So there's a lot that tells you there. I like this map that my colleague Casey made, Casey Neese, that is my data activist at Frontline. And this map really shows you where all of these Black land was located. It's not sufficient for us to say like, okay, so if you look at it, this is like how much reparations Black people should have, but land itself is a value that increases. And so this map shows where it's green, it stayed in Black ownership. And then as the density increases, it just shows the amount of money and fertility that that land had to help come up with some sort of equation to explain it outside of just income loss. Lastly, if we think about, Indigenous people, we can't really count for reparations, right? They were here before any of us. And the movement of occupation of those lands is well reflected in this map. And it happened very quickly. So that's a little bit about a primer on reparations and conversation around it. What I would tell you is that most politicians, there isn't really any politician that endorses it. Kamala Harris, she has a bill that's about offering families at a certain income level $500 a month. And her argument is that it would uplift Black people, about 60% of Black people, by that allotment itself, but shows you how bad the condition is of poverty itself. And just when a lot of people sort of talk about absurdities or impossibilities of these claims, I just want to point out that, the US government successfully pressured post-war German government to pay Holocaust survivors through the Luxembourg Agreement, that this has happened before. Oftentimes, even with the Japanese reparations, it took a long time for the apology to come, because with an apology, it acknowledges wrongdoing. But again, reparations were given to surviving people. There is a commission proposal right now that has been socialized on the Hill. And it's not a reparations bill, but it's a commission to study, develop reparations proposal for African Americans that we, the Mile High Farmers, and other organizations are pushing for. So I feel like I diverged, but I wanted to give you that conversation if it was important to you. And I'm also happy to take energy questions as well, if you guys want.
Not too much to add to that. I mean, I feel like, what I was saying before about colonization, I think if you are not sure if reparations make sense or are fair, my guess is you haven't learned enough about this history. And to me, it seems really strange to see what happened here, to see the genocide that happened here, to see the ruthless form of slavery that happened here. That, sometimes people say, well, slavery happened in other places on the earth. It did, but it did not look like it did here. This was a very ruthless, I sometimes think there needs to be different categories of name for what happened here. And so I just feel like if you learn about that history, or, for me, even just like taking a road trip. I remember in college driving through Colorado and Kansas and just feeling overwhelmed at thinking that this land was filled with people and their blood is here. And of course, there are survivors and there is strength there still. And so I just can't imagine knowing about the history of enslavement or the genocide that happened here and not like bending over to be like, how do we make this right? We have become the most wealthy nation, blah, blah, blah. How do we make this right? So to me, a lot of the framing around the argument, I find to be very painful, and just to show that there isn't really a sense of remorse, possibly. I don't really see how you could not have remorse for genocide. And I think, I think about even like people like my mom, who is new to this country and maybe has nothing to do with what happened here, and yet knows something needs to be righted. And why wouldn't you support that? So, and I think the details, again, I believe that part of justice is letting communities that have been impacted by harm lead. So, what do Black people want as reparations? How do they want that to work? Right now, I see a lot of the arguments being shaped by white people who want to say how this would work. And of course, at some point, we're going to have to get into agreement, but why would you not let the community lead? And the other thing I want to say is that, our system really values certain types of wealth. So it also just makes sense that we're like, well, how do we make it right? We just give wealth, but it's the harm that was done was much more than like $10 billion worth of blah, blah, blah stolen. So I think there's also something there to think about. And the last thing I would say about it is if you look at all of the research that shows who cares most about environmental issues, connection to the land, air, water, food, actually people of color care the most. So I think it's also like sort of beautiful that part of what people are asking for is the land. And I have a feeling, in permaculture, there's this idea, the problem is the solution. I have this idea that I have a feeling that if we were to give large swaths of land to people who've been most harmed by the system that caused climate change, we would find a lot of solutions to climate change, and people would be willing to carbon farm and grow polycultures and grow and tend to the land in a way that doesn't necessarily cause the harms that we've seen with the growing system that we have.
Thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
And Fatuma, we still have time. I definitely want to dive into the specifics of your knowledge around energy justice. But there's one more, broader question before we get more specific, if that's okay. Given that the topic is resisting environmental injustice through education, this is kind of the flip side of that, of instances in which education might perpetuate environmental injustice, and particularly the higher education system. So a question from an audience member is, do you feel that the dominant culture in higher education further removes people from the ability to decolonize their thought process?
Me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that, certainly what I was speaking about in terms of like epistemology and questioning knowledge itself, is a part of that conversation. Obviously, these higher, these institutions of higher education are places that manufacture knowledge or lead in sort of what is relevant knowledge. And it's important to understand, like, even when we think of like the Royal Academy of Science and its establishment, and who were the nobility that were seen and credited more for their theories in that time, and just how our own, understanding of Western knowledge itself has been shaped, and who the knowledge keepers were themselves in that way. And so, of course, like our education system, we often analyze it in terms of our young people, and are in a fight right now about basic, what we consider to be like scientific facts about certain things that are so politicized. I feel I've seen reproduced myself in higher education. I've experienced myself, and I've chosen to leave certain places because of that. And one of the things that I understood, is, of course, I'm always not a naive person, but a hopeful person. And as a hopeful person, I always thought that the higher up in systems of education I personally went, that the easier things would be, and that the less racism and isms I would experience. And it broke my heart to struggle, and the further I went, to see that it was even harder and fewer people like me. And specifically in my field of studies of political science, like the study of Africa itself as a region doesn't really even exist as a comparative politics framework. So much racism in political science around even Africa, which is not still a long lost dark continent. You could get on an airplane and get there, and there are cars and just things, that are hard to like contend with. And so as I was like, climbing that ladder and really struggling with that, it really struck me. It's like, when I was young and I'm a soccer player, and I'd experienced a lot of racism on the soccer field. But when I was playing one day and I experienced all of the parents yelling some crazy things to me on the sideline, like, don't give her a yellow card, give her a green card, stuff like that, and more violent. And I was like, man, I can't believe these parents are saying that to me, right? And it just really horrified my sense of justice. So when that happened and I'd gone back to my family and I was kind of talking to them and they were kind of like, man, Fatuma, like you really need to understand this. Like when you say that, you know, you think like you were going to get them in trouble if their parents heard, but like, where do you think that that knowledge came from, you know? And so I always remembered that as like I had to rectify my own experiences and feelings and take them as legitimate. I'm a fighter. So like when things are, you know, spiritually, you know, like when things are hard, I'm like, I'm gonna overcome this. That means I have to overcome it. And so I've overcome those things with family support and a lot of like grief. And I'm glad in some ways that I've gone through a lot to be where I am even now in terms of processing those kinds of things. But certainly in my experience, I feel like as a person, I embodied those experiences of seeing colonial mindset not only re-articulated, but kind of, I feel like re-put back on me in my body in those intellectual spheres and even my own forms of knowledge. So those were a little bit of stories from my own personal experiences. But Michelle, I know you have experiences too.
Yeah, you working at CU and
Yeah, and I really love this question. I think I'd start theoretically first, which is, but not theoretically. You know, I think one of the weird things that I started to see at CU, and especially in contrast to some of our colleagues like Dr. Ajume Wingo, who's in the philosophy department at CU, and having traveled to Uganda to look at sustainable urban agriculture and traveling to Mexico actually as part of CU as a delegation with the Colorado River. I just see this thing in education where it's like, even when we're learning about things, there's like no way to act on them. So you have students right now on this call who are studying environmental engineering, they're studying how to fix water systems, and they can't touch or change anything around them, you know? And, you know, I just remember seeing like in Uganda, we'd be like, okay, you know, the way that we would do a water system is we'd move this from there, and people would like get up and start moving things, you know? And you're like, oh my gosh, right. Like, you know, at CU, I helped co-teach a permaculture class, and we're learning about gardening and farming. And you're not allowed to pull out a weed on the lawn. You're not allowed to rip out some lawn. You're not allowed to just plant stuff at CU. So really thinking about this weird form of education where it's like you have to get so much education, and so many people feel like they have to get so much education before they can act on the world, you know, and just how different that is than, say, you know, learning to cook from your mom. Like, it's not like you have to read about it and then, you know, if you do good on some test, you know, it's just like chop this onion. You're like, I don't know how to chop an onion. She's like, well, you're just going to do it until you figure it out. So it's a really different approach to education. And I also think it's another way in which I think the good and the bad, or I guess the way to put it is more the just and the unjust things in our systems actually are found everywhere. And so even in the most privileged place like CU Boulder, you still have a generation of people who don't feel like they can plant a seed. I remember having events and giving people seeds and having, you know, 50, 60, 70% of the people be like, what can I do with these seeds? I don't have a place to plant them, you know. And it's not just education. I think, you know, I'm a renter, and I feel the same way just as a renter. I'm like, I don't have the right to just like grow what I want outside, and I don't have the right to even like paint or change my surroundings in a way that around the world would not make any sense. You know, like, this is your space. Why would you not be able to grow a cucumber outside? Why would you not be able to plant a tree when a child is born? So I feel like there's some things in education that really need to be looked at. And I think, again, the third world, or what is known as the third world, really leads on some of that stuff. I think the writings of Paulo Freire with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you know, what education could look like, is like earth shattering. And same with Ivan Illich. You know, reading some of these things that will bring into question even the most fundamental parts of our education, that I think also lead to environmental degradation. So, you know, I just think there's some difficulties in the US with really getting into the ways that even the people who are benefiting from these unjust systems are actually being harmed, because it's an impossibility to just have the benefits. There's no way that it hasn't harmed you. Yeah, so how could you learn to take action? How could you enact the things that you're learning, and as well as honoring the knowledge of people who do the work, regardless of their PhD status. And I think that's actually harder to do than it sounds. I feel like when I say that, it sounds super easy, you know, and it's not. And I know for me internally, something I struggled with for a long time is like, I don't know if I can speak on this panel. I don't have a PhD in environmental engineering, you know, but then at the same time being like, but my mom should speak on the panel because she knows how to do this stuff. So anyway, I think that there's some real fundamentals and some real fundamental inequality that people in our culture are so used to feeling that they don't break through, even in a place of education where you're supposed to learn to question everything.
Thank you, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
And Fatuma, here's an opportunity to get energy specific. This question was posed by someone who's interested in the private or corporate food sector, but I'm going to open it up to also the private and corporate energy sector, asking if it's possible to translate environmental justice into a sector that's so often inherently exploitative or oppressive. And I guess you can answer to both food and energy given your background.
Food I can answer easily. Let's take a walk in energy, since I think it's important for you all to really engage in the energy justice conversation. And I found a lot of times in a lot of environmental studies programs, we're really focused on sort of the professional development and other components, and leave out some of these important questions that I think is vital for us to be equipped with, no matter how we're working within that sphere. So, you know, energy justice itself is kind of like, as a coined term, more of a new concept, but really falls into a lot of the same environmental justice conversations and emanates from a lot of that discourse. And within that, so I want to, you know, list 6 themes that are important to think about when doing energy-based work. So one is like where siting is, the siting of these hazardous and polluting facilities. 2 is thinking about, you know, the air and water pollution that happens from operating these facilities. 3 is the contaminated site cleanups that happen as a consequence of it. 4 is the disposal of hazardous waste that goes along with this. 5 is the impact of raw material development. And 6 is the transportation of raw material and waste. And these are all, you know, really relevant to all forms of energy. So we often think of conventional energy, with coal being, you know, arguably the most environmentally destructive fossil fuel in terms of extraction, emission, and knowing how it particularly affects communities of color. Natural gas, we really see a lot of these issues around extraction, and particularly with fracking right now. It's interesting how, you know, even in Colorado, Weld County has been such a big leader in it and had petitioned to split off into a state called Fractopia. But when a multi, you know, well project was going to be placed next to a predominantly white school there, it was opposed and quickly moved right next to a Black and Hispanic school in that community. And then of course, Boulder has the moratorium on fracking. And then of course, when we think about nuclear, it's all the issues of extraction of uranium, which is mostly on native sites, has been tested generally on indigenous land. So we think a lot about the siting of these facilities. But I think that a lot of you all are probably more interested in conversations around renewable energy. And I just think it's really important, because in so much of like these conversations around environment, the danger is that we're trying to think our way out of like the amount of waste that we produce and the amount of extraction that we're used to. And so a lot of times we take as natural these other solutions without thinking of their same consequences that are only going to even be more exacerbated and relevant maybe in a few years, but we do know that they're relevant now. So it's not to say to throw out all of those technologies and that some of them don't certainly, offer improvements. Of course, when we talk about wind energy, a lot of it has to do with siting oftentimes on native lands. There are some complaints around sound, but we don't see as much health complaints. Same with hydroelectricity. So much about an issue of displacement of indigenous people across this land. About 4 million people are displaced annually due to hydroelectric dams. 80 million have been displaced in the last 50 years from 300 large dams. The Three Gorges dams is a great example. Solar, solar cells, how they're produced, and of course their disposal. And then a big one that even, discussing with some of my students, we like to take out of this, but is the whole biomass one that's being kind of, it's touted or sometimes represented as being highly used, although we don't see a lot of increase in its use in the United States. Of course, like biomass is used for fuel sufficiency in a lot of other parts of the world and has led to environmental degradation, but it scares me to think of it constantly as an example of a form of renewable energy. And I always think about the saying that within that system of thinking, like, a tree to us is worth so much more dead than it ever was alive. And I don't believe that that's true, right? So the last thing is like, when we think about recycling and different things like this, it's important to think about like, and energy production, who is doing those harmful jobs, where they're located, what are the consequences of it? And so I've just been focused a lot more on renewable energy and trying to find like, obviously, improvements better, but really decreasing our consumption patterns is the best.
Thanks, Fatuma. Michelle, is there anything you'd like to contribute, whether from the energy justice or food justice perspective?
I think I'll continue with the energy side, which is, there's a lot of low-tech solutions. And again, it's sort of one of those things where it's like, it's hard to go through this whole process, get like a PhD in environmental engineering, know about like, nanoparticles and how they work in solar panels, and then realizing like we could cut 30% of our energy use with passive solar design. That's not even talking about insulating the homes better, thinking about windows, even thinking about their placement, just in a place like Colorado, turning it south, thinking about what we do with the west side of a home. So there's actually some real ways that we could be reducing consumption if we cared. And then the other thing I want to say in terms of energy justice is that, again, so much attention is being placed on the technology. And what I find hopeful is there's a lot of really good work being done on the ground that says not just like energy justice is not just about creating renewable energy. It's about looking at the energy system and saying what is flawed and what is unjust about this system. And a lot of what's unjust is who owns these systems and what their interests are. And so there's a lot of communities that are moving towards community ownership of energy and of renewable energy. And so I find a lot of hope in that. And actually through my work, we're supporting an energy justice campaign in California. And at CU, we brought Trees, Water, People and Henry Red Cloud to CU that is working on that type of energy justice. And I have found a lot of difficulty in working with policymakers actually around this, where they are so focused on, we need this many solar panels in this region, that they miss the part about like, what are the legal barriers to communal ownership? What are, there's a lot of infrastructure questions that go beyond just how do you get the energy, as well as what are you doing with it? And that's a place where I think it relates to food and water, or food and energy, where we waste 30 to 45% of the food that is produced in the US, and I think energy is the same thing. If we can save 30% just by turning a house to be passive solar, that means we're wasting 30% of our energy. So I see a lot of hope in yep, and a lot of that energy is going into food, absolutely, and growing it in a toxic way. So there are a lot of confluences here, and I think that part of what is difficult is that a lot of people's understanding of justice is very surface, and it's just like, who has access to the energy? And we need to ask much deeper questions. Like, ultimately, again, it's the questions that I said I had at the beginning. Who benefits and in what ways? Are they life-giving ways, or is it just convenience? And who is harmed and in what ways? Are they harmed because it's inconvenient, or are they harmed because everybody in their community has asthma or is basically held economically hostage by a corporation that doesn't care about them or their region?
Thanks. I think I'll ask one more question and then give y'all a couple of minutes each to make any final points if the questions haven't touched on something that you definitely want to share with the audience. So this question, given the audience, is focused on academic research, and you've both spoken a bit to knowledge coming from communities into academia. This question is more focused on dissemination of knowledge from research. Do you have recommendations for how to communicate things like academic research in ways that can reach diverse communities, or how do we make knowledge universally accessible?
I would be so the first thing if we can go back and forth, I will say I would be so careful about this and really interrogate, why do you want to do this? And do you really have knowledge that the community doesn't have? And do you really have knowledge that the community needs? Are you the right person to bring that information to the community? I think that a lot of tension between academia and communities is historical. Communities have experienced people coming in and being like, let us tell you the right way. I mean, to bring it back to food, all women were really told that formula was better for babies than breast milk. But for Black and brown women, I mean, even in my experience and my family's experience, even as recently as 5 years ago, it was like, yeah, generally breast milk is better, but your baby needs formula, and this is really what is best for your community and for your family. So, there's a really, there's like the beautiful forms of science and really like the quest for knowledge. And then there's this inflated sense of rightness and knowing, which is completely in line with the history of European colonization, basically, that I would have people be very careful about. And part of what is difficult about it is that culture is something that you're swimming in all the time. One of my favorite definitions of culture is a set of beliefs, behaviors and practices that a group of people have that they think is natural and natural human behavior, right? So, even that thing where it's like, competition, like, what is it? Competition and like strength. What is it called? It's like the strongest, survival of the fittest. Even just that idea, it's so perfect coming from a culture that clearly acts that way. That's not the only truth. That's not the only truth in reality. That's certainly not the only truth in nature. So I would be really careful. And like, how can you interrogate that when you don't realize that you're doing it? I think about the formula example and so much, really nasty medical history that really is founded in the same set of beliefs of like, we just have a better way and you're backwards. And that stuff gets communicated whether you mean to or not. And I think better questions, again, are going to a community and seeing like, what's working right? Who already holds this knowledge in the community? Yeah, if you're talking about like nuclear physics, maybe nobody in the community has that knowledge. But if you're talking about like how to process water, how to grow food, how to be healthy in a pandemic. Actually, pretty much every community in the world has some resources for that. And the places that don't, I feel like are places that have been railroaded by a system that says that it knows best and you don't know best. And that goes to youth not feeling like they can get their hands dirty because it's like, no, the landscape architect knows best. So I would just be really careful about that. I did chat earlier, a resource that I love that one of my old colleagues at CU used to run, Heidi McCann, who's a Native woman, that's called Iloka, that really tries to bridge ELOKA, that really tries to bridge Indigenous and scientific knowledge. And I think more projects like that are needed, and people that see that knowledge goes both ways. And I think academia, not only is it hyper confident in going out into communities, it's also impervious to the feedback and to the wisdom coming back in. So, I think there's projects like that where people know that actually knowledge creation is a two-way street. Most communities are going to feel hesitant when you have outsiders coming in saying, we actually know the best way, even if you're scientists, even if you have good intentions. And a lot of bad stuff has been done with people with good intentions. So, how do you interrogate that? And, earlier we had a question about spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And, I think it's also important to have white spaces where people can interrogate and try to flesh some of that stuff out, especially when they're accountable to communities of color. And so, how do you dig in and start doing that work? Not so you can be like, I did my duty for a year and now I do know what's best for the community. But so that you can really pause and interrogate your purpose. What are you doing? Why are you going to that community? Do you not think that community can do it? Are you just wanting to channel resources and hype them up? That's different. So I'll try to stop there.
Thank you, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have much to add to that. I think that was a great answer. The only thing I would say is that, depending on what the topic you're dealing with, even if it's like hyper technical where we need to bring in air quality particulate measurement scientists, for a certain thing, is that you're interacting with humans and communities ostensibly in whatever type of work you're doing, and that they are place-based no matter what. And so, I encourage using forms of community participatory models. You should never get at a point in your research or data where it's like, how do I present this back to the community I'm doing it for? That shouldn't really be a question. And to be fair, academia, nonprofits don't lend themselves the best to creating deep relationships in communities or the way we operate in time. So I think that, in approaching research, I have different steps that I do, from data analysis, creating an algorithm, whatever it is, thinking about how you're including those people along the whole step of the way, right? So it's not about just at the end to justify the legitimacy of your work or its relevance. We see so much research, people spend so much money. That's why it's called the nonprofit industrial complex, to produce reports that only cycle back to them. So I appreciate the question as a data activist myself, because I also always think about that of like, as I'm doing work in community, like how am I making this so that those who I work with in the community can create this cool infographic. Sometimes the information can be represented in different ways across different spaces. So I appreciate that, but really agree with what Michelle said, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you both. Well, we ended up right up against the end. And so I think I'll pass it over to our hosts to wrap it up. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat about books that perhaps Michelle and Fatuma, you could contribute to, but otherwise, Belle, do you want to take it over? And thank you again to you both.
Yep, sure. Thank you so much. So I just want to take some time to thank our wonderful panelists once again, Michelle and Fatuma, for sharing your extensive experience and insight. And then also to thank our amazing moderator, Dr. Laura MacDonald as well.
Yeah, and a special thank you to Dr. Jana Milford, Abigail Weeks, the Bold Center, the entire Environmental Engineering Department and staff, our program director, Professor Fernando Rosario, and everyone else who participated in organizing the series over the semester. And then finally, thank you to our audience and attendees for your engagement and your thoughtful questions.